Officer ROARS at the King's Guards, United Kingdom. Outside Buckingham Palace, the wide open space was already filling with visitors from all over the world. Some spoke softly, some laughed, and many held phones and cameras ready, waiting for the moment they had traveled so far to see. The King's Guards stood in their familiar places, tall and unmoving. Their red uniforms were bright against the gray stone behind them, and their black bearskin hats made them look almost unreal, like figures from a history book. They did not turn their heads. They did not blink in any way that could be noticed. To the crowd, they seemed more like statues than people. Children whispered questions to their parents, asking if the guards were real or made of stone. Parents smiled and nodded, telling them that yes, they were real, and that they were trained to stand completely still. A few steps away from the guards, a police officer watched everything carefully. He had been on duty since early morning, long before most of the tourists arrived. His uniform was neat, his shoes polished, and his expression serious. Unlike the guards, he was allowed to move, to speak, and to act when needed. His job was not ceremonial. His job was to keep people safe, to manage the crowd, and to make sure no one crossed lines they should not cross. The officer had done this duty many times before. He knew how quickly excitement could turn into trouble. People often forgot where they were when they stood in front of the palace. They became careless, stepping too close, ignoring signs, and pushing forward for a better photo. Most of the time, calm words were enough. A raised hand, a short warning, and people would step back, embarrassed but understanding. Today, though, the crowd felt different. It was larger than usual and more restless. Tour buses arrived one after another, releasing waves of visitors who rushed forward, afraid of missing something important. The officer noticed how quickly the space filled, how voices grew louder, and how the clear paths began to disappear under moving feet. He walked slowly along the edge of the crowd, watching faces and body language. Years of experience had taught him what to look for. He saw people leaning forward too far, stretching arms out for photos, and stepping beyond the painted lines on the ground. Each time he spoke firmly but politely, asking them to move back. Most listened. Some pretended not to hear. A few rolled their eyes but obeyed anyway. The King's Guards remained silent through it all. Their stillness never changed. Even when a camera flash went off right in front of them, they did not react. Even when someone laughed too loudly or spoke right at their face, they stood firm. This discipline impressed many people, but it also made some forget that rules still applied. The guards would not move, so some visitors assumed nothing would happen if they crossed a line. The officer felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. If someone tripped, if someone fell, or if a serious rule was broken, it would be his duty to respond. He could not rely on silence or tradition. He had to be alert every second. He adjusted his radio and scanned the area again, noting where the crowd was thickest. Near the front, a group of tourists edged closer to the guards than they should have. They laughed, pointing at the uniforms and whispering jokes. One person stepped forward, crossing the clear boundary meant to keep distance. The officer noticed immediately. He raised his voice slightly and called out a warning, clear and firm. The group hesitated but did not move back right away. The officer walked closer, his boots making a soft sound against the stone ground. His face remained calm, but inside, his patience was thinning. He had already given several warnings that morning. He knew that if one group ignored him, others would follow. Order depended on consistency. Around them, cameras continued to click. People were more focused on capturing the perfect image than listening to instructions. The officer felt as though he was becoming invisible, his authority fading behind the attraction of the guards. This feeling was familiar but never comfortable. He reminded himself to stay professional, to stay calm. The King's Guard stood only a few feet away, eyes forward, bodies straight. They gave no sign that they noticed the growing tension. To them, this was part of the role. Silence was their language. Stillness was their strength. But to the officer, the situation was changing fast and silence could not solve it. A light wind moved through the open space, lifting the edges of coats and scarves. The officer took a slow breath, steadying himself. He thought about the balance he had to maintain. On one side was tradition, respected and admired by millions. On the other was safety, something that could not be compromised, no matter the setting. The crowd shifted again, pressing forward in small steps that added up quickly. The officer noticed a child near the front, squeezed between adults, too close to the guard's path. His concern deepened. This was no longer just about rules or respect. This was about preventing an accident before it happened. He stepped forward once more, positioning himself clearly between the crowd and the guards. His presence was meant to remind everyone that this place, though historic and famous, still required discipline. Some people noticed and stepped back. Others continued to focus on their screens, unaware of how close they were getting. The officer's jaw tightened slightly. He could feel eyes on him now, some curious, some impatient. He knew that whatever he did next would be seen by many and possibly shared far beyond this courtyard. Still, he reminded himself that his duty came first. Behind him, the guards remained unmoved, symbols of a tradition that demanded absolute control. In front of him, the modern world pushed forward, loud and distracted. The space between these two worlds felt thin, fragile, and ready to break. As the officer stood there, watching, waiting, and calculating his next move, the morning no longer felt calm. The air seemed heavier, filled with unspoken tension. This was only the beginning, though no one in the crowd fully realized it yet. Something was about to change, and the quiet order of the courtyard was standing on the edge of a moment that would be remembered. The officer stayed in his position, standing firmly between the crowd and the guards. At first, things seemed to calm down a little. A few people stepped back and some lowered their phones. The officer felt a small sense of relief, but it did not last long. The crowd was still large and more people kept arriving from the sides, filling any space that opened up. He glanced at his watch. The next scheduled movement of the guards was approaching. He knew from experience that this moment often caused trouble. When the guards marched, people rushed forward to get better photos or videos. Even those who had been warned before sometimes forgot everything in their excitement. The officer adjusted his stance and scanned the area again. He noticed several individuals near the front leaning forward, whispering to each other, clearly planning to move closer when the guards began to march. He felt tension rise in his chest. He had seen this pattern many times, and it rarely ended smoothly unless action was taken early. He raised his hand and spoke again, louder this time but still controlled. He asked everyone to stay behind the marked lines and to give space. His voice carried across the front rows, and some people finally looked up from their screens. A few nodded and stepped back. Others frowned, clearly annoyed. One man shook his head and muttered something under his breath. A woman beside him rolled her eyes and kept her phone raised. The officer noticed but chose not to react. He had learned that engaging emotionally only made things worse. He focused on the bigger picture, on keeping the space clear and safe. The king's guards remained still, their presence calm and unchanging. They did not acknowledge the officer or the crowd. Their role required complete focus, and they delivered it perfectly. To many visitors, this silence felt almost like permission to do as they pleased. The officer understood that misunderstanding, but understanding did not make his job easier. The crowd grew louder as more people arrived. Children asked questions, adults answered, tour guides spoke into small microphones, and phones kept recording. The peaceful sound of the morning had been replaced by constant noise. The officer felt his patience thinning again, stretched by repetition and pressure. Suddenly, someone stepped fully over the boundary line. It was not done with bad intent, just carelessness. The person wanted a closer photo, a better angle. The officer reacted instantly, stepping forward and calling out a clear instruction to move back. The person froze, surprised, then slowly stepped away. For a moment, order returned. But that single step had encouraged others. Two more people moved forward, then another. It was as if once the line had been crossed, it no longer felt real. The officer's heart rate increased. He knew this situation was slipping out of control. He moved quickly along the front, repeating his instructions, his voice firm and direct. Some people listened. Some argued quietly. A few pretended not to hear at all. The officer could feel frustration building, not just because people ignored him, but because they did not understand the risk they were creating. The guards were about to move. The officer could sense it. He watched them closely, noticing the subtle signs that most people missed. He knew that once they began, anyone standing too close could be startled, lose balance, or cause a chain reaction in the crowd. He took a deep breath and positioned himself again, standing tall and visible. He wanted to send a clear message without creating a scene, but the crowd's focus was not on him. Their attention was locked on the guards, waiting for the moment. The march began. The sound of boots against the ground echoed sharply. The guards moved forward with perfect timing, their steps strong and controlled. The sudden movement caused excitement in the crowd. People gasped, phones rose higher, and several individuals pushed forward without thinking. The officer felt a surge of urgency. He raised his voice again, louder now, cutting through the noise. He instructed everyone to stay back immediately. His tone was no longer just firm, it carried authority and warning. Some people reacted instantly, stepping back in surprise. Others hesitated, unsure whether to listen or continue filming. The officer noticed the child again near the front, now even closer to the moving guards. Fear flickered through him. This was the moment he had been trying to prevent. He stepped forward quickly, guiding people back with open hands, careful not to touch anyone. His movements were fast but controlled. He repeated his instructions again and again, his voice steady but intense. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air. The crowd responded unevenly. Some followed his directions. Others complained loudly, claiming they had the right to stand there. A few accused him of overreacting. The officer ignored the comments. His focus remained on safety, not approval. The guards continued their march, eyes forward, expressions unchanged. They did not slow down or adjust their path. Their discipline allowed no hesitation. The officer understood that their role required this precision, but it added pressure to his own actions. As the space tightened, the officer realized that calm warnings were no longer enough. The noise of the crowd threatened to drown out his voice. People were no longer listening carefully. Excitement had taken over reason. He felt a mix of emotions rising inside him. Frustration, concern, responsibility, and exhaustion all collided. He had been patient. He had been clear. Yet the situation kept worsening. He knew that if someone got hurt, it would weigh on him long after this moment passed. He planted his feet firmly and raised his voice once more, stronger than before. This time his command carried across the courtyard. It was sharp, direct, and impossible to ignore. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Even those at the back felt the shift in the air. The sound broke through the noise like a sudden clap of thunder. People froze, surprised by the intensity. Phones lowered. The push forward stopped. For a brief moment, everything seemed to hold still, as if time itself had paused. The officer stood there, breathing heavily, aware that all eyes were now on him. He did not look angry, but his expression left no room for argument. His message was clear. This was not a suggestion, and it was not a performance. It was a matter of safety. The guards marched past, unbothered, their rhythm never breaking. The child near the front was now safely behind the line, guided back by an adult who finally understood the seriousness of the situation. The crowd slowly began to settle. People stepped back, forming a wider space. Some looked embarrassed, others looked annoyed. A few looked thoughtful, realizing how close things had come to going wrong. The officer remained alert, watching closely as the guards completed their movement. His heart slowly began to slow, though the tension still lingered. He knew the moment was not over yet. What had just happened would not be forgotten quickly. Whispers spread through the crowd. People spoke about the officer's strong command, about how sudden and powerful it had been. Cameras had captured everything. The officer knew that this moment would likely travel far beyond this place. As the guards returned to their positions and the courtyard regained some order, the officer stood quietly, gathering himself. He knew he had done what was necessary, even if it was not popular. Still, he could sense that questions, opinions, and reactions were already forming. This was no longer just another shift. The balance between tradition and duty had been tested, and the impact of that test was only beginning to unfold. The sudden quiet after the officer's loud command felt strange, almost unreal. Just moments earlier, the courtyard had been filled with noise, movement, and excitement. Now people stood still, looking around as if waking from a dream. The officer remained where he was, shoulders squared, eyes moving carefully across the crowd. His breathing was heavy, but his posture stayed firm. He could feel the weight of attention on him. Some faces showed surprise, others confusion. A few people looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. Phones were still raised, but many had stopped recording, unsure whether to continue. The officer did not speak again right away. He knew that silence, for a moment, could be just as powerful as words. The king's guards completed their movement with perfect timing. Their boots struck the ground in steady rhythm, their faces calm and unreadable. They showed no sign that anything unusual had happened. To them, the moment passed like any other. Their discipline did not allow reaction, and that alone made the contrast even stronger. As the guards returned to their positions, the tension slowly began to ease. The crowd shifted again, but this time backward instead of forward. People gave more space, forming a clearer boundary. The officer noticed this change and felt a small sense of relief. The danger had passed, at least for now. Still, the moment had left its mark. Whispers moved through the crowd like a soft wave. People leaned toward each other, speaking in low voices. Some praised the officer for stepping in. Others questioned whether such a strong command had been necessary. A few shook their heads, clearly unhappy about being interrupted during their visit. The officer heard none of the words clearly, but he felt the judgment in the air. He had been in similar situations before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the size of the crowd. Maybe it was the cameras, or maybe it was simply the setting, where tradition and public expectation collided so openly. He adjusted his radio and spoke briefly to a colleague, confirming that everything was under control. His voice was calm again, steady and professional. The sound of his own controlled tone helped him settle his thoughts. He reminded himself why he was there. He had not acted out of anger. He had acted out of duty. Near the front, a few people approached the boundary again, but this time they stopped themselves. They glanced at the officer, then stepped back without being told. That small change did not go unnoticed. The officer nodded slightly, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the message had been understood. A parent bent down to speak to the child who had earlier been too close. The child listened carefully, eyes wide, clearly affected by what had happened. The officer saw this and felt a quiet sense of reassurance. If nothing else, the situation had reminded people that this place was not just a photo opportunity. It was a working space with real responsibilities. Time passed slowly, then more normally. The crowd noise returned, but at a lower level. Laughter sounded again, softer now. Tour guides continued their explanations, adjusting their tone to match the calmer mood. The courtyard seemed to breathe again. The officer remained alert. Experience had taught him that calm could be temporary. He continued to watch movement, spacing, and behavior. His muscles still held some tension, ready to react if needed. But deep down, he hoped the hardest part of the day was over. Then he noticed something else. Several people were clearly focused on him now, not the guards. Some whispered while pointing in his direction. A few held their phones in a way that suggested recording had resumed, but this time aimed at him. The officer was aware of this, but he did not let it change his behavior. He stood as he always did, professional and composed. He understood the reality of modern life. Moments like this did not stay in one place anymore. They traveled quickly, shared and reshared, often without full context. A single clip could spark strong opinions, both positive and negative. The officer accepted that risk when he chose this job. What mattered to him was that no one had been hurt. A senior officer approached him quietly from the side. There was no anger in his face, only curiosity and focus. They exchanged a few brief words, low and private. The senior officer nodded, glancing once at the crowd, then walked away. That simple response told the officer everything he needed to know. His actions had been noted and understood. Still, the officer felt the emotional weight of the moment settle in. The rush of adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind tiredness. His legs felt heavier and his shoulders ached slightly. He shifted his stance, careful not to show fatigue. The shift was not over yet. The guards stood silently, once again becoming the main attraction. People returned their attention to the bright uniforms and still figures. The officer faded back into the background of the scene, just another part of the system keeping things moving. But inside his mind, the moment replayed again and again. He thought about the exact second he raised his voice. He wondered how it sounded to others. He questioned whether he could have done something differently. These thoughts were natural, but he did not allow them to distract him. Across the courtyard, a few tourists discussed what had happened. One said the officer had been right. Another said it felt too intense. A third shrugged and said it made the visit more memorable. Their opinions varied, but none of them had stood in the officer's place, feeling the pressure of responsibility. As the crowd slowly changed, with some people leaving and others arriving, the atmosphere stabilized. The flow became easier to manage. The officer continued guiding people with quieter instructions now, his earlier commands still echoing in their memory. At one point, a man approached the officer cautiously. He spoke politely, saying he understood why the officer had acted the way he did and thanked him for keeping everyone safe. The officer nodded and thanked him in return. The exchange was brief but meaningful. It reminded him that not all reactions were negative. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting sharper shadows on the ground. The morning had moved forward, but the moment lingered in subtle ways. The officer could feel it in the way people listened more closely now, in the way they respected the boundaries without being reminded. He stood near the same spot, watching as the guards remained unmoving, symbols of tradition and discipline. He thought about how different their roles were, yet how connected. Both existed to serve something larger than themselves. Both required control, patience, and strength, just expressed in different ways. The officer knew that later, when his shift ended, he might see clips online or hear discussions about what had happened. People would debate, analyze, and judge. Some would see only a few seconds and form strong opinions. He accepted that reality with quiet resolve. For now, his focus stayed on the present. The courtyard was calm again, but not careless. The officer's presence, once challenged, now felt respected. He remained ready, alert, and steady, knowing that duty did not end with one loud moment. It continued in the quiet minutes that followed, where attention and responsibility mattered just as much. And though the guards remained silent, their stillness and his voice had together shaped a moment that would not be forgotten easily. The rest of the day moved forward, but the feeling of that moment did not disappear. Even as the crowd slowly changed and new visitors arrived, the officer sensed that something important had happened. It was not just about controlling people or giving instructions. It was about how one action, taken in seconds, could create long discussions that lasted far longer. By the afternoon, the officer was asked to step aside briefly. He was not alarmed by this. He had expected it. In places like this, every unusual moment was reviewed carefully. He followed a senior officer to a quieter area, away from the noise of visitors and cameras. The change in surroundings felt sudden. The open space and moving crowd were replaced by calm walls and low voices. Inside, the atmosphere was serious but fair. No one raised their voice. No one rushed to conclusions. The officer was asked to explain what he had seen and why he had acted the way he did. He spoke clearly and honestly. He described the crowd behavior, the child near the front, and the risk he believed was growing. He explained that his intention had been to stop a dangerous situation before it happened. Those listening nodded as he spoke. They had access to footage and reports, but they wanted to hear his perspective directly. The officer felt nervous, but he did not feel regret. He knew he had acted with the right purpose. Even so, being questioned always carried weight. He chose his words carefully, staying calm and respectful. While this conversation happened, the outside world was already reacting. Short clips had begun spreading online. People who were not there watched only a few seconds and formed opinions quickly. Some praised the officer's action, saying it showed responsibility and courage. Others questioned the tone and wondered if things could have been handled more quietly. The officer did not see any of this yet, but he could sense it was happening. This was how things worked now. Moments no longer belonged only to those present. They became public property almost instantly. Still, he focused on the room he was in and the people in front of him. After the discussion ended, the officer was thanked for his explanation and asked to return to duty. No punishment, no praise, just acknowledgement. That response felt balanced. It told him that his actions were understood, even if they would continue to be discussed. When he returned outside, the courtyard looked much the same as before. The guards stood still, tourists gathered, cameras clicked. But for the officer, everything felt slightly different. He felt more aware of every step he took and every word he spoke. Not because he doubted himself, but because he understood the attention that now followed him. Some visitors recognized him. A few looked at him with curiosity. Others whispered as he passed. The officer kept his focus forward. He did not let reactions change his behavior. His duty remained the same, regardless of opinions. Later in the day, he spoke with a colleague during a short break. They talked quietly about the situation, sharing thoughts and experiences. The colleague reminded him that no matter how careful someone was, public duty always carried risk. Decisions had to be made quickly, often without perfect conditions. Hearing this helped the officer feel less alone. As the hours passed, the crowd remained calmer than usual. People stayed behind the lines more naturally. Parents kept children closer. There was a noticeable difference in behavior, subtle but real. The officer saw this as a positive outcome. If awareness had increased, then the moment had served a purpose. Behind the scenes, officials continued reviewing footage. They looked at angles, timing, and reactions. They compared this moment to past incidents. Their goal was not blame, but learning. Could procedures be improved? Could communication be clearer? These questions mattered more than public noise. The king's guards, meanwhile, continued their duties as always. They did not comment. They did not react. Their role did not allow it. Yet their presence remained central to the discussion. Many people talked about the contrast between silence and command, tradition and modern responsibility. That contrast made the moment powerful. As evening approached, the light softened, and the number of visitors slowly decreased. The officer felt the long day in his body. His feet ached and his shoulders were tight. Still, he remained attentive until the end of his shift. He knew that responsibility did not fade with tiredness. When his shift finally ended, he walked away from the palace grounds with mixed emotions. Relief came first. Then reflection. He replayed the day in his mind, step by step. He thought about the second he raised his voice, about the faces in the crowd, and about the silence that followed. At home later that night, he finally saw some of the online reactions. He watched a short clip of himself, taken from a distance. Seeing it from the outside felt strange. The clip did not show everything. It did not show the moments before, the warnings, or the growing risk. It showed only the loud command and the sudden stillness. He read comments from people he would never meet. Some supported him strongly. Others questioned his approach. A few misunderstood his intention completely. He felt a brief sting, but he did not let it settle. He reminded himself that most people judged based on limited information. He closed his phone and chose not to read further. He knew who he was and why he had acted. That mattered more than opinions formed in seconds. In the days that followed, the discussion continued. News outlets mentioned the incident briefly. Some used it as an example of the challenges faced by officers in high-profile locations. Others focused on the balance between ceremony and safety. The story slowly moved on, replaced by newer events. For the officer, however, the lesson stayed. He became even more aware of how quickly situations could change. He paid closer attention to early signs of risk. He refined his communication, choosing words and timing carefully. Not because he feared criticism, but because growth mattered. The experience also strengthened his respect for the guards. Watching them stand through chaos, noise, and attention reminded him of the discipline required in different forms of service. Their silence and his voice were not opposites, but parts of the same system. One quiet morning later that week, as he stood on duty again, he noticed something simple but meaningful. A visitor began stepping forward, then stopped, reading the sign and stepping back without being told. The officer watched this small action and felt a sense of quiet success. Not every impact was loud. Some were silent and lasting. The officer understood now that duty was not just about enforcing rules. It was about protecting people, preserving respect, and making decisions that might not please everyone. It was about standing firm when needed and staying calm when questioned. The moment outside the palace had tested him, but it had also confirmed why he chose this path. Responsibility was heavy, but it was also meaningful. And as he stood once more between tradition and the modern world, he carried that understanding with steady confidence. Time moved on as it always did. Days passed, then weeks, and the busy courtyard outside the palace returned to its usual rhythm. New visitors arrived every morning, full of excitement and curiosity. Many of them had never heard about the moment that once filled the space with tension. Life continued, steady and forward, but for the officer, something inside had changed in a quiet and lasting way. He returned to his duties with the same dedication as before, but now with deeper awareness. Every shift felt slightly more meaningful. He paid closer attention to how people moved, how crowds formed, and how small signs could grow into larger problems if ignored. Experience had always guided him, but this event sharpened that instinct even more. The officer noticed that he communicated differently now. His words were still clear and firm, but his timing had improved. He spoke earlier, before situations reached the edge. He used calm gestures more often, guiding people with presence rather than volume. Most visitors responded well. They seemed more willing to listen, more respectful of the space. Sometimes he caught visitors watching him closely, as if trying to decide who he was. A few recognized him from the clips they had seen. One afternoon, an older man approached him politely and said he had seen the incident online. The man said he admired how the officer stayed focused and calm afterward. The officer thanked him and returned to his position. Compliments were not what he worked for, but they reminded him that understanding existed too. The guards continued their silent service, unchanged and steady. Watching them day after day, the officer felt a strong sense of connection. They never spoke, never reacted, yet they carried immense responsibility. Their stillness demanded respect, just as his actions did. Both roles required discipline, patience, and emotional control. Over time, the story faded from public attention. New topics replaced it. New moments captured the spotlight. This did not trouble the officer. He never expected the moment to last forever. What mattered was what remained after the noise faded. One morning, while standing at his post, he noticed a group of schoolchildren arriving with their teacher. The children were excited, talking loudly, pointing at everything. The teacher gently reminded them to stay back and respect the space. The officer watched as the children listened carefully, their faces serious with understanding. He smiled slightly. This was the kind of respect that truly mattered. Later that day, the officer found himself thinking about how people viewed authority. Some saw it as control, others saw it as protection. He believed it was a balance of both. Authority without care was empty, and care without firmness could fail. His role required both, and he accepted that challenge fully. In quieter moments, he reflected on his own journey. He remembered why he joined the service in the first place. It was not for recognition or attention. It was to help, to protect, and to stand steady when others needed guidance. That purpose felt stronger now, not weaker. One evening, as his shift ended and the sun dipped low, casting warm light across the palace walls, the officer paused for a moment. He watched visitors slowly leave, their footsteps echoing softly. The guards remained at their posts, silent and strong, framed by history and tradition. The officer felt a deep sense of pride. Not loud pride, not showy pride, but the quiet kind that settled in the chest. He knew that not every decision would be understood by everyone. He knew mistakes were always possible, but he also knew that doing nothing when action was needed was never the right choice. He walked away from the courtyard that evening with steady steps. The city moved around him, full of life and stories of its own. Somewhere people were still sharing opinions, still discussing moments caught on camera. But those discussions no longer held power over him. What stayed with him was the lesson. Duty was not about being liked. It was about being present. It was about standing firm when needed and stepping back when things were calm. It was about understanding that real service often happened in moments that passed quickly but left lasting impact. The officer carried that understanding into every new day. Each shift became another chance to apply what he had learned. Each crowd became a reminder that safety, respect, and awareness were shared responsibilities. And so, the story did not end with a loud command or public debate. It ended in quiet strength. It ended in balance. It ended in a man who understood his role more clearly than ever, standing between tradition and the present, ready to act when needed, and steady enough to remain calm when silence returned. In that space, where history met everyday life, the officer continued his duty, not seeking attention, not avoiding responsibility, but embracing both with confidence and care.